I'm delighted to welcome U.S. Ambassador-Nominee to Libya, Jennifer Gavito. Ambassador-Nominee Gavito previously served as the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Her assignments abroad have taken her to the United Kingdom, the United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and Nicaragua. In Germany alone, she has served in Munich, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart. Closer to home, she served as the Director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. Within the State Department's headquarters, she has served in several positions within the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran, Iraq, and Public Diplomacy, Director of Maghreb Affairs, and as the Libya Desk Officer. Prior to joining the Department of State in 1998, Ambassador-Nominee Gavito worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury as an Economic Analyst and is a proud graduate of American University in Washington, D.C. That is quite an impressive career. It's a real pleasure hosting you here at ISD. We're thrilled to have you.
I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me in on a Friday afternoon.
Of course, our pleasure. Before we continue, I'd like to ask audience members to start thinking about questions they'd like to pose to Ambassador-Nominee Gavito. We'll begin taking those shortly in the Q&A box. When you add your question, please be sure to include your name and affiliation. Ambassador-Nominee Gavito, I had the honor of not only working with you for nearly 2 years during your role as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran, Iraq, and Public Diplomacy, but we also sat down for an interview while I was a journalist in Beirut back in 2004, near the beginning of your career at State.
You're making me feel old.
I already feel that. Looking back to those early days, what initially attracted you to foreign affairs? What thoughts led you to decide on this career? In other words, what is your diplomatic origin story?
Sure. And thanks to everybody that I can't see right now that has taken time out of their days to join this as well. My story is, I think, pretty idealistic. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, in a small suburb, and I just from early days really felt a yearning to be somewhere else. I tried to teach myself French with a French dictionary when I was 7 years old, and it kind of spiraled from there. And so when the opportunity came up when I was 15 to do a year overseas with the AFS exchange program, I jumped on that and went to make us feel really old, I went to what was then West Germany for a year in a very small rural town. As part of that year, we took a family trip to Luxembourg and passed our beautiful embassy there, which is in an old villa, not so unlike the one that we're in today. And truly at that moment, I thought that's what I want to do. My experience as an exchange student and the experience working with exchange students back in Kansas City really taught me that you see the lens of the world through the people that you talk to. And so, like I said, it was very idealistic, but I learned very quickly that people's first impressions of the United States came from their interactions with me. And if I could be a good representative, if I was able to portray the good of America, then generally speaking, their concept of America would also be positive. And so I really knew then that I wanted to do that on a bigger scale. And so I came back and I applied to American University. Small footnote, I also applied to Georgetown University that did not accept me. So I landed up Massachusetts Avenue a few blocks and kind of went from there.
Great. My mother, who was born in Turkey, actually came to the States on an AFS. So
really?
That program has been around and changed a number of lives. I know.
It absolutely changed mine.
Your answer actually leads into the next question. So as diplomats, we not only represent the U.S. government while we're posted abroad, but we also represent the diversity of the American people and the American experience. How has your background and identity shaped how you approach diplomacy?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, what I just said, it started for me on a very grassroots level. And so as a diplomat, I have placed extraordinary importance on being out, talking to people, understanding where they're coming from in their lives, and as an American diplomat, most importantly, helping them to understand where we're coming from. I think that, our politics over the last 10 years have really driven home for me the importance of having a foreign service that is representative of America. And specifically, having grown up in the Midwest, that is a part of America that, a lot of people overseas, and certainly the leadership of a lot of countries, don't necessarily engage with. Their perceptions of America are very much based on experiences in New York, Washington, maybe Boston, maybe California, maybe Texas. But being able to convey the sense of what America is from, that very wide swath between those states, I think has been really important in helping our counterparts and our partners overseas really understand how complicated and multifaceted the United States really is. So that's been important to me. I think we're going to have a chance to talk about being female in the Foreign Service as well, but certainly, I'm working in a part of the world that continues to be very patriarchal. And so, but I'm happy to turn it back over to you and address that as you want.
Yeah, absolutely. That does go to this question that I had prepared. So you've spent much of your career working in the Middle East. These are by and large patriarchal societies. How have you managed to live and work in these countries? And what advice would you provide to up-and-coming female officers who are contemplating working in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, but might have some reservations because of this?
Just do it. It has been, so I started, as you alluded to, I started my career first in Germany, and then from there went to Nicaragua, where I met my husband. He and I both independently read From Beirut to Jerusalem while we were in Nicaragua, and both became fascinated with Beirut in particular. And so when the opportunity came up to go to Beirut, I jumped on it, and honestly, I've never looked back. I have done some work in Europe, although certainly the way that we work with Europe, the way that we partner with them on global issues, the Middle East continues to play a super important role there. And so I've never been that far away from it ever since, I first landed in Beirut in 2003. When you're a diplomat, you're speaking on behalf of your country, and that is an exhilarating obligation. And in my experience, which, has, seen its ups and downs for sure, but in my experience, people in these countries respect the position that you're bringing into it. And so I don't feel for the most part like I've been viewed as a woman. There have been circumstances that have been maybe a bit uncomfortable where, women are not necessarily sitting at the table in the same way. But for the most part, I've found that our interlocutors are very respectful of the role that our female diplomats play. And so I don't feel like it's been a hindrance at all. I would say to anybody aspiring, it is such an important and not as well understood region of the world. And in fact, the Middle East, whether you talk about North Africa or Egypt or the Levant or the Gulf, in and of itself, it's quite multifaceted. We need people that understand it well. And if you do, and if you bring that depth of knowledge to it, your professional opportunities, honestly, are going to be extraordinary. And that's what I've really enjoyed throughout this experience is the level of responsibility and the ability to engage on significant issues at high levels of government, really from quite early in my career. So I can't recommend strongly enough working on the Middle East. The beauty of the foreign services, everybody has their own passions and it all seems to balance out. But for me, I don't feel like being a woman has hindered me there, maybe even helped in some ways. And so, if anybody out there is interested in going down that road, I would be happy to engage and tell you more.
Great. I do have a number of female students in the class I'm teaching in the Middle East now, and so I do imagine some of them might want to reach out.
I think that would be great.
Allow me to get your perspective on how the Department of State is doing in its efforts to achieve greater gender parity. Looking at the Foreign Service, women comprised 43% of Foreign Service generalists and just 29% of Foreign Service specialists as of 2022. Those already low numbers decline as women move up the ranks. Looking at ambassadorial assignments, women filled just 28% of those roles in 2020. You're a welcome exception to this general trend. In your opinion, why do the share of women decline in the Department of State's higher ranks, and what can the department do to recruit and retain more women as they advance in their careers?
Thanks for that. It is a very important question, and I know one that the Department of State is spending a lot of time and has been spending a lot of time thinking about. Those numbers have shifted since I came in. The 40% was about accurate when I started 25 years ago, but certainly the share of female ambassadors has gone up over time. I do think there's a couple reasons for it. I think that over the course of years, there's some self-selection that happens. The reality of a career in the Foreign Service is that it is a commitment and service that comes not just from the individual, but from the whole family. I myself have 2 teenage boys. They have, if I'm honest, pretty mixed feelings. One of them is dying to get back overseas, and the other one has discovered that he kind of likes life in the DC area. And so it is a commitment by the whole family and not one that's without its sacrifices. I believe that they've been worthwhile, but that is something that each family has to decide for themselves. And so I think that as women continue through their lives, I've been single in the Foreign Service, I've been a newlywed in the Foreign Service, I now am a parent of 2 kids who are looking at college in the not so distant future. I've kind of seen it all. The career changes as you change, and there are people that decide along the way that they, for whatever reason, their families, for whatever reason, would prefer a lifestyle that maybe isn't quite as nomadic. As an aside here, I think that when we talk about gender equality, when we talk about supporting women, it's important to support women in all of their choices, including the choice that maybe a career change it's become the right moment to consider that. But I do think the department is doing important work to try to make it more accessible for women and for longer. A lot of it has to do with things like spousal employment. That's a tricky issue. We often say smart people marry smart people.
Ambitious people
marry ambitious people. And so, you're dealing with families where, by definition, unless you're a tandem couple, where both are in the Foreign Service, and that comes with its own challenges, one person tends to be the lead professionally, and that doesn't necessarily satisfy everybody's ambitions. And so the department is looking at different ways to make sure that the family members of our officers overseas are in a position to do meaningful work that allows them to reach their own professional goals. There's a lot more to it, of course, having schools available, making assignments accessible in places that high school kids are able to thrive, where there's schools that will support their own ambitions. I'm certainly learning that those are important too. And so it is an iterative process, to be sure. There has been a lot of soul searching about it. And again, I do think it's important to recognize that we have made some real wins. One of my favorite pictures from my time in Embassy London is a picture of the senior staff, where virtually all of the section heads from the Charge d'Affaires, to include the Charge d'Affaires, were women.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, a picture that you would not have seen 20 years ago. And so we are making progress. We are elevating capable people regardless of, what categories they may fall into. My goal would certainly be to make sure that competent, capable people are given all the tools and all of the access that they need to continue to make their own decisions about how long and how far this career should take them.
Right. I imagine when we were working together on Iraq recently, that front office picture would have been similar. There were a number of leading women in the Bureau of Near East Affairs.
Yeah.
Speaking of trying to manage 2 teenage boys, can you talk about work-life balance?
Sure.
Throughout your career, as your kids were young, as they grew up, how have you managed that challenge?
Listen, I decided pretty early that, I was joked, I really like my husband. I really enjoy spending time with him. And so made it a priority to be able to do so. I think that, and again, times are changing, but I do think that as women, and also in parallel as professionals, there is this tendency to try to be everything to everyone. And certainly, there is a piece of that within our culture. But I try to stay cognizant for myself of what my own internal red lines were. And if I can give you an example, I was both pregnant and had a newborn while I was on the staff of the National Security Council.
Oh, wow.
Not necessarily something that people would recommend, not sure it's something I would recommend. But I first of all have to say that the leadership was unwavering in their support. And I decided that for me, it was important that I get home at the end of every day to be able to give my newborn son a bath and put him to bed. And I have to tell you, in the 6 months that I was at the NSC after I went back to work, I think I missed one day. And I forget the exact reason, but since it was Syria and Lebanon, I'm pretty sure that it was a dramatic one. But because I was able to articulate in my own mind what I needed, and because I was able to have that conversation with my bosses, I found it a situation that was navigatable. I don't know if that's a word. I think it's when we take pressure on ourselves and don't articulate and don't kind of lay out what those lines are, that you can find yourself in a position where you're doing things that you don't feel comfortable with. And that certainly was not my case. There were times, I will say, that I had to go back into work, that I would, unfortunately, it was during BlackBerry days, but no computers at home at the time. And so I would go back into work on occasion, but I learned from that experience how important it is to just be clear for yourself what those lines are. I also think it's important, in a world where we do spend a lot of time talking about work-life balance, to acknowledge that balance shifts over time. And so there have been moments in my career where I have dedicated more time to the professional side. And there have been moments where I've taken my foot off the gas and given myself that extra time. You can't, what's the famous line? You can't have it all the time. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are going to be moments where it isn't possible to walk out the door and leave work in the rear view mirror. And if that's a priority, then that will come into play in the types of assignment that you choose to take. But I have found it possible to navigate that and to prioritize whatever for me was most important at a particular moment in my family's life.
That's a wonderful attitude to have. I imagine in your upcoming role, that'll be something that you need to kind of practice and make sure you display or show to people working for you as ambassador. I wonder if you have any thoughts about mentorship. I know you mentioned, for example, your bosses at the NSC really displayed that and made clear that they want you to have that work-life balance. Can you talk about your experience with other mentors in your career and have any inspired you to continue moving up the ranks?
Hugely. I do think that this is one of the best things about the Foreign Service. I think that we are a mentor-driven institution. I will never forget my first day walking through the cafeteria at Maine State and somebody stopping me. I was 23. I think you could tell that I was rather young. And they stopped me and they said, are you a new FSO? Are you a new 100? That's so great. But really, because of our somewhat hierarchical or I don't know what you have to describe it, a rank-based system, you have an opportunity at every level to be mentored, to grow, to develop. And that honestly was one of my favorite things about the Foreign Service, was I had that opportunity to learn and not feel like I was somehow behind by taking advantage of those things. I've had amazing mentors. I've, not just amazing mentors, I've had amazing champions as well. And I do think it's really important to differentiate between the two. I have had people that have really boosted me, have given me opportunities, have watched out for me and made sure that I have continued to evolve as an officer. I've had mentors that have, helped me navigate difficult personal and professional situations. It is really ingrained in our workforce and in the Foreign Service that mentoring is a deep responsibility that we all share. And we are all expected to take part in that, both as mentees and eventually as mentors. And so, never be shy about asking for advice, never be shy about asking somebody if they would have time for coffee or a talk. When I came in, it was hard to find people that were like me. I was young, I was single, I was female, and I very much wanted to figure out who might share that experience with me and what I might learn. That's not as hard to find anymore, but if you find someone that you admire or you want to emulate, I can virtually assure you that they will be amenable to working with you.
Right. No, I found that as well. Never have you asked someone for advice and they suggest they don't have time.
Yeah.
You should go somewhere else. We are waiting on some questions from the audience. And while those stream in, let me ask about your experience maybe transitioning from your previous career. You worked previously at the Department of Treasury. The process for applying into the State Department is a long and sometimes exhausting one. I imagine the same is probably true for becoming an ambassador. So how do you manage that experience where you don't know you aspire to become a Foreign Service officer, but you've got to pay the bills, you've got to continue developing your skills? How can you kind of work on that?
So I feel like this is a question not unlike people asking for advice these days on the Foreign Service exam. It has been so long since I've done this, and truly this institution has changed so much. But I came in during an era of blind testing. And so when we took the test, both written and oral, nobody had any background on it. They had no idea if you were a Nobel Prize winning economist, or in my case, a recently graduated with a BA degree in economic policy. They had no idea what languages you spoke. And so it was rather blind. For me, that worked out wonderfully. I took the written exam in the fall of my senior year at AU, and then I took the orals during my last week of finals. Okay. And so I actually didn't have that big of a gap. But what was a bit odd about my experience was we had this massive hiring freeze, which may sound familiar to some people, but we had this massive hiring freeze through the early 1990s. And so I went to my oral exam, and at the end of it, I don't know if they still do, but at the end of it, they called the people into the room that passed, and I was not in the group that was called into the room that passed. So I went home and started at Treasury, I think a few weeks later, and just kind of moved on with my life. And my mom called one day about 3 months later, and the hiring freeze had been lifted. And so all of us, many of us, they had only taken a very, very small subset because there was no money for hiring. And so they were able to drop the qualifying score. And so suddenly at 23, I was in the pipeline. And because there had been this stall in the process, I was able to move pretty quickly. So I was only at Treasury for about a year. What it taught me was, maybe evident today, I like talking, I like engaging. I have the deepest admiration for my colleagues at Treasury, but it was a lot of very exact numbers, and I work in a much more ambiguous way. And so I think it worked out for both the State Department and Treasury that I moved on.
Yeah. I recall early on in our A100, our kind of training introductory seminar, we all took the Myers-Briggs tests. And a disproportionate number of foreign service officers are ENTPs. Very disproportionate. Any thoughts on people who are introverted, who maybe aren't part of the ENTP cohort? There is a place for that in the
There is service. Absolutely a place. First of all, I'm an ENTJ, so I'm way different than you guys. But yeah, the extrovert piece of it. I will also say is if I wind my way to 50, my extrovertedness has fallen off quite considerably. So I would say I'm very middle these days.
Do you mean you don't go out to bars as much? Or are you less talkative?
That too. I used to go to every diplomatic reception I could find. Now they get me a little tired. I feel it at the end of the night, and talking to people that I don't know is more mentally straining than it used to be. But no, the great thing about the Foreign Service is, I've kind of approached this from a generalist standpoint, but you mentioned specialists. There is a place in the Foreign Service for it. We have engineers, we have radiologists, we've got doctors, we've got office management specialists, we've got federal agents through diplomatic security. Literally there is a place for everybody, including by diversity of personality. And so, no, I think that what a lot of people have in mind as kind of the outgoing side of diplomacy, certainly that exists. I wouldn't maybe start with a recommendation of public diplomacy, for example, for someone who is more introverted. But I myself am actually an economic officer. And, you can build your career in so many different ways. Right. And you can reinvent yourself as things change, as you change. And so anybody who thinks that the Foreign Service isn't the place for them, I think, please talk to somebody about the opportunities, because truly it is a place for everyone.
Right. And one thing I've really enjoyed about the Foreign Service is that it evolves with you, right? So you can, as you said, every 2 to 3 years, you can tweak your career a little bit. You can do something interesting, something different.
Absolutely. If you like managing people, those opportunities are there. If you don't like managing people, those opportunities are there. You can work on negotiations, on air transport agreements. You can, work on pandemic issues. You can work on the environment. You can help families be reunited through the consular services. Whatever your passion is, the Foreign Service is broad enough to encompass that.
We have some excellent questions coming in from our audience. I'll start with Becca Warwick, who's a staff member within the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. She writes, "Thank you so much for your time today, Ambassador-Nominee Gavito. In your opinion, what's the difference between leadership and management? What does excellence in leadership mean to you, and how might you lead differently as an ambassador than in previous roles you've had?"
Thanks. That's a great question. And the differentiation between leadership and management is something that I think the State Department has really been looking more at in recent years, starting really with Colin Powell as our secretary. Management, to my mind, is the acknowledgement that the work that a lot of us do on a daily basis is breaking, It's urgent. In some cases, people's lives are on the line. And whatever your unit is, whether it is an office, whether it is an embassy section overseas, whether it is a front office, kind of taking a broader look at things, whether it is a bureau, what we call a functional bureau that supports, you have to manage that. And you've got to manage what those breaking events are in ways that protects U.S. interests, protects the American people, and fulfills the mission of the Department of State. Leadership, again, to my mind, is really taking a step back from that and making sure that you are giving your team the tools and the confidence and the resilience to do that in a way that helps them grow. And we talked a lot about the Foreign Service evolving and growing with you. That depends on good leadership, to my mind. And so it is making sure that you are fostering an office and an environment where people want to come to work, where they want to grow. I would say, one of the things that I pride myself most on, and Joe can give you the backstory if he disagrees with any of it, but I have worked really hard throughout my career to create teams that enjoy being together and enjoy doing the work that they're doing. I think that that is fundamental to doing a good job. If you come into work and you don't like the people that you're around, you feel like you have animosity in your relationship with your superiors, you're not throwing yourself into it. And so I have worked really hard over the course of the last 25 years to make sure that that unit is one where people feel like they want to grow together, they want to support each other and not break each other down. I think that is a fundamental tenet of leadership. Also, since we're talking about diversity today, I want to say that I do think that good leadership is where diversity starts. We talk a lot about statistics in the Foreign Service, how many women are in these positions, how many other protected categories are in these positions. It has long been my belief that if you give somebody a good leader, one that helps them develop, one that mentors them and champions them and provides them with skills, that person will be committed to the institution of the Foreign Service. And so they will continue to bring their diverse views, their diverse perspectives, their diverse backgrounds into this workplace. If you give people bad managers, if you give people bad leaders, they're not going to stick around.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's where you have to start, making sure that whatever the leader or manager looks like, that they are providing that for their employees. I've had leadership positions, particularly over the last decade or so, and learned something a little bit different from each one. And so I think I just continue to approach each situation as unique as it is. And that, our offices, our embassies are all unique. They all have different pressures. And so you have, as a leader, you have to engage with the moment and who the people are. Your team changes all the time. And your team's priorities change. And so it's hard to say, looking too far out, what that looks like. But that kind of is a snapshot of what my priorities have been over the last number of tours.
I can attest from personal experience that, you have really created in the jobs you've had a welcoming atmosphere, some places where people can excel in the ways that they really need to excel for their own people. So thank you very much for that. The next question is from Maggie Lehman, who's a student here at Georgetown. She wrote, as a woman working in diplomacy and foreign service, what is your biggest piece of advice for young women early in their careers who want to advance in this field?
Jump in and don't hold yourself back. Again, I think it's become very cliche, but one thing that I have seen in recent years is I've been responsible for hiring people into positions. There really is a gender difference in women putting themselves out there. The statistics on this are real. That if you lay out a list of 5 qualifications from a gender perspective, men will generally look at it and say, yeah, I meet 3 of the 5. I'm totally qualified for it. Women look at it and say, I meet 3 of the 5. I'm not even going to apply. I'm not qualified. And so I personally spend a lot of time encouraging women, you cannot get a job. You cannot move ahead if you don't at least engage in the discussion. And so don't hold back. One other, kind of very narrow piece of advice that I think somebody gave me before I walked into my first big country team as a first tour officer in Frankfurt in the late 1990s was anytime you go into a meeting, have something to say. We'll add, don't feel like you need to say it at length, but know why you're there, know what your contribution is, and be ready to add that. Don't be shy about adding your voice. Other people won't.
The next question is from Letitia at J. She is a student currently studying international studies and minoring in German. I'm interested in pursuing a career in foreign service, and diplomacy is especially interesting to me. The thing is, I find a lot of aspects of international politics interesting, and I'm not sure what I should pursue first and where to get my start. Learning how to network can also be overwhelming, so I guess I would like to know what you would recommend for someone like me who wants to take advantage of as many opportunities as possible, but doesn't know where to start.
So, I mean, it's hard to say without knowing what the opportunities specifically are. By all means, the place to start is taking the Foreign Service exam. And again, this goes back to, I do understand that it is harder to come in as a 23-year-old today than it was maybe in my generation.
Is that right? Is that those statistics reflect that?
I believe they do. About half of my 50-person A100 class was under the age of 25. Because today you can see what experiences people bring to the table. Maybe somebody like me, fresh out of college, the same qualifications maybe as somebody else that's coming a bit later. That being said, it does, this is a career that is meant to start you and then move you up. And so first and foremost, take the Foreign Service exam. You're not committed to anything. Yes. And just kind of follow your passions with it. I was telling Joe before we started this, I filled out an application for USAID. I was studying until I dropped for the Foreign Service, my master's in international development. I filled out a Peace Corps application. I think just getting out into the international field is worth so much, whether that path brings you back around to the Foreign Service eventually, or whether that's where you start off. Just getting that experience in the field is absolutely vital. And the networking, there is no better place than DC. Those of you who joined today clearly know that because you're taking part in conversations like this. But there are great organizations out there. I'm happy to recommend a few offline, but you can certainly find them by Googling that are focused on women in national security, that are focused on, young alumni and national security. So just take advantage of being in DC and showing up at these events and getting to know people. I have certainly learned over the years that there is no replacement for networking.
Right. And for those who are tuning in from outside of DC, we do have our Diplomats in Residence program across the country, including in the Midwest.
Exactly.
Where I'm also from. So I appreciate that very much. One question before we turn to the next question from the audience that I was wondering, I'd like to hear your thoughts on. We've recently introduced this lateral entry program, which in a way is for mid-career professionals who have skills and experience that we really seek at the State Department. That speaks to this kind of diversity of professional experience.
Yes.
Can you tell our audience a bit more about that program and how they can take advantage of that?
First of all, let me say I'm not the expert on it. So Joe just rightly mentioned our fantastic diplomats in residence who are at universities across the country, and they know this program inside and out. I know because I have talked to them about this program, and I understand from them there is tremendous interest. And so I think the first tranche of applications have now closed.
I believe you're right, yes.
I'm not sure what the then plans are for future tranches, but it is an opportunity to take that hard-won experience on a range of issues that are of critical importance to the United States government and be able to apply them not at a junior level where most of our careers start, but more at the mid-level. And what that does for us as a service is gives us an opportunity to bring in people that have really made a name for themselves in areas that are emerging, like China, the Arctic, different types of STEM and cyber issues. And so if you fall into that category, definitely something to look at. What's been exciting for me is in the networking that we just talked about is having conversations with people who are accomplished professionals and normally never would have considered coming into the State Department because, again, you do start at what we consider to be an entry. And they're looking at the Foreign Service now because they see a pathway to taking the skills and the knowledge that they've acquired and applying it in a government setting, including overseas. And so I actually think it's really exciting. I don't believe that the first tranche has been, the applications have closed, but it hasn't been hired yet. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of lessons learned from it. But by all means, reach out to the diplomats in residence to find out more.
Great. We have a question from Brecken Costley, who's an incoming student at Georgetown. You spoke about the challenges spouses face in finding employment opportunities abroad. Do you happen to know any intelligence specialists / FSO couples? How accommodating is the State Department in finding joint assignments with other agencies?
I would have to direct you to our human resources team on that. I can speak to the State Department side of things, what we call tandem couples, where both are employed by the State Department. It certainly is a good way to make sure that both individuals have fulfilling careers and that we as an institution are taking advantage of all the talent that is out there. Like everything, it can be tricky. There is not a guarantee that all of your tours are together. I think, a lot of tandem couples find over the course of a career that they do spend periods of time working in different places. But at the same time, the State Department really does make an effort to try to figure out how to make that puzzle work. It just, may require sacrifice on the part of one or both individuals as they look, for two positions that fit exactly what your specialties are at exactly the right time. So I know people that have, taken a year off and have found that to be a really fantastic opportunity to spend time with family. Others who work maybe in the same kind of general region, Vienna and Bratislava, necessarily in the same embassy. And so there's a lot of ways to find success in that.
Yeah, the department has become more flexible with some of this stuff. You mentioned the year off, the leave without pay program, which I think is up to 3 years of time, which allows couples to perhaps go back to graduate school or to take time off to raise children.
Yeah, no, it's that has been a huge game changer. The other thing that we now have are what we call DEDO positions, and if you know what DEDO means, then you are a step ahead of me.
I do not. I use the phrase all the time.
But it essentially lets, in these situations, one piece of that couple do their work remotely from an overseas location. Right. So that the family can stay together.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time. I know things are busy this time in your career. I am excited for you in your next assignment.
I'm really excited too. It is a great team out there.